I'm the VP of Product Marketing here at Degreed. Our agenda today is to cover three things. The balance of power in learning and development is shifting from HR and L&D to employees and managers. And so we want to talk about, number one, why we think it really is finally time to start rethinking L&D approaches and priorities. Number two, what we think it'll take to start putting learners first. And number three, how to start rewiring the L&D infrastructure in order to do a better job delivering the kinds of things that both people and employers need. We're going to try and cover all of that in about 30 minutes. At the end, we'll have some contact details for us. If there's anything that you'd like to follow up on, feel free to get in touch. So we're going to talk about why we think that it's time to stop struggling to connect L&D to learners. People's number one job concern these days is obsolescence. 60% of workers, both millennials and non-millennials, think that the skills they have now will not be what they need on the job in 3 years. That's data from a recent survey by Oxford Economics and SAP. So the point is, learning and development are essential for everybody. But in survey after survey, those same workers say that the education and training they're getting at work is not preparing them for whatever's next. This right here, this data is a particularly grim example, but it's also one of the most recent that I've seen. There's plenty of other data that says similar things. The point here is 85% of employees don't feel like they're getting what they need out of the training that they're getting from their companies. So I think two things are going on here. One is that for some people, they simply don't have access to training at work. And for a lot of people, that might be true. There was some research that Accenture had done that said something like less than half of college grads got any formal training in their first jobs. But the bigger issue for us is that a lot of the opportunities that people do have access to just aren't very well connected to their jobs. They're not connected to their career plans, and they're not really connected anymore to the way that people work, to their habits. The proof of that is in the data. Up and down the career ladder, organizations are saying they don't have enough people with the right knowledge and skills. Almost 60% of employers, according to McKinsey & Company, think that new college graduates are not adequately prepared for the workforce. And a lot of those same kids actually agree. And that skills gap balloons as people move into management and leadership roles. Some similar data from Burson by Deloitte said that 74%, almost 3/4 of companies, report having persistent shortages of talented mid-level managers. And more than half of them say they don't have a strong bench of senior executives. So we think a big part of that is, a big part of why, is the changing nature of work. All across the economy and around the world, a lot of routine tasks are being automated. So more and more jobs require primarily creative thinking and problem-solving skills, not just the ability to follow directions and routines. And if you think about a job that used to involve a lot of routine, like machine operators, for example, today they're not just pulling levers and pushing buttons anymore. They're programming and monitoring robots. And it isn't just blue-collar jobs either. Everything is changing constantly. The half-life of many skills these days is just 2.5 to 5 years, according to Deloitte. So if you think about, for example, sales and marketing, which are very creative, non-routine jobs, data, software, social media, e-commerce, all of these things are fundamentally changing how people buy everything, from books and clothes to enterprise software and jet engines. And that change is still unfolding. So people are constantly having to learn and relearn skills, new things. And the point there is that products, competition, regulations, all of these things can change in just a matter of weeks now. But it still takes most L&D organizations 5 to 12 weeks to create just 1 hour of interactive e-learning. If you multiply that across a typical company with dozens of job roles at multiple levels, there's just no way that most L&D organizations can hope to keep up. But what people learn is only half of the equation. The other half is how they keep their skills sharp. And here, traditional L&D practices are falling short as well. For a lot of organizations, they're stuck very stubbornly in the past. More than 3/4 of what L&D teams do is still formal training. This comes from the data in the Burson by Deloitte Corporate Learning Factbook. What it says is that 3/4 of the training that organizations delivered is still mostly in classrooms with instructors. And yes, a growing portion of that is virtual classrooms and self-paced courses, but that misses the bigger point. And the bigger point is that less than 1/4 of workers say that they've completed an entire course of any kind in the last 2 years, at least not voluntarily. And that's our own data. We did a survey last year. But what people told us is that more than 70% of them are saying they've learned something work-related from an article, a video, or a book this week. The point is that L&D approaches, methodologies are out of sync with how people are learning. BP, the big oil and gas company, their director of learning innovation and technology, a guy named Nick Shackleton-Jones, put it really eloquently. He said that most L&D organizations are only beginning to think about shifting from courses to performance support. But meanwhile, most employees are already relying on their networks and Google to get most of what they need informally in the moment. And they're starting to integrate apps into the way that they work too. And organizations, by and large, are nowhere near that stuff yet. And those disconnects are turning into a big problem for a lot of L&D teams because employees and their managers are increasingly empowered, largely through the internet, to take control of their own development. And if they don't get what they want and need from their L&D or HR business partners, they're just going to go out and get it themselves. And many of them already do that. Technology training is probably the best example I can find. Over the last 5 years, for example, chief learning officers have cut IT training nearly in half, from almost 10% of their budgets to just 5% now. And at the same time, technology has become a critical part of how businesses operate, more than ever before. So what's happened is that chief learning officers are forced to almost double their training budgets from 3 to 5%. And keep in mind that IT budgets are generally a lot bigger than L&D budgets. So it shows you where those priorities lie for different parts of the organization. And even still, I come back to what I said before about it's difficult for the organization to keep up with individual needs. Even though CTOs are spending a lot more of their budgets on training, almost 2/3 of IT workers have dug into their own pockets for training and certifications. And this trend, this sort of shadow learning trend, isn't just limited to IT. 43% of workers, according to a survey by Apollo, big education company, say that they've looked for learning opportunities outside of their company at least half the time. So the takeaway for me in all of this is that conventional L&D methods just aren't responsive enough to keep up with today's learners. So it's time to try some new approaches. And that starts with changing some pretty fundamental attitudes about the role and the priorities of the L&D organization. But don't take my word for it. This is a quote here from David Stranick, who's the global head of learning at NCR Corporation. And what he said is that traditional learning methodologies just don't work anymore with the speed of business, the global nature of the workforce, and the new generation of employees. And what he's saying again is that the diverse needs, or the needs of the workforce, are too diverse and too fast changing for the L&D organization to keep up. So part of the solution is to start putting learners first. We think that the most important shift to make here is about mindsets. It's putting learners not just at the center, but at the beginning of how the L&D organization operates. And that sounds semantic and it sounds easy, but it's not apparently. Because pretty much everyone in L&D recognizes that most learning doesn't happen inside classrooms or learning management systems. The 70-20-10 learning framework, which says that only 10% of learning comes from formal training, 20% comes from other people, and 70% comes from experiences on the job, is almost 20 years old. So it's pretty amazing to see, which is in the bottom side, the top bar here, how far most corporate L&D teams are. This again is that Burson by Deloitte Corporate Learning Factbook data. And what it shows is 70% of training is delivered through formal classes and courses. only 8% comes from social and collaborative methods, and only 16% comes from informal, on-demand activities that are integrated into the way that people operate on a day-to-day basis. But the first step toward recovery is to recognize that you have a problem. And so when CLOs and their teams acknowledge that this is a problem, then they start approaching a lot of things very differently. And they also start investing their time and their budget differently. And a big thing that they do differently is to think about the role and the definition of L&D itself. So if you believe, for example, that the role of the organization's learning team is to manage training and development, then you make some very, very different choices about some very basic questions. Like, who's responsible for driving L&D activity? Is it the HR and L&D organization, or is it employees and their managers? When and where does learning happen? Does it happen on a schedule at work, or can it happen anytime, anywhere? What and why are people learning? Are they learning for operational efficiency and regulatory compliance, risk avoidance? Or are we focused on building the strategic capabilities and performance that are going to help drive the organization forward? And how do people learn? Mainly through formal classes and online courses, or are they learning in the flow of their work? So Janice Burns, who's the CLO at MasterCard, believes that her team's job is to be motivators and facilitators more than anything else. And as a result, they're prioritizing providing people with tools, resources, and access rather than simply providing them with training. And thinking that way has prompted the L&D team at MasterCard to experiment with all kinds of new and unconventional approaches to learning development and performance improvement. So for example, they've created animated role plays and games to teach new hires, especially recent college grads, about compliance. And they're trying to do it in a way that's more engaging for those people. They're pairing short videos with quizzes to get new external IT hires up to speed very quickly on the payments industry so that they can do their jobs as quickly as possible better. So that they have the context to understand how to do their jobs and where the technology that they're working on fits into the industry. MasterCard's putting invitations for 5-minute tutorials on people management skills directly into leaders' calendars so that they can make it easy for people to refresh themselves, to remind themselves about little but important things that lead to better people management. And they're producing scheduled 3 to 6 week blended learning journeys to get product managers up to speed on innovation and entrepreneurship techniques, and also to diffuse their digital capabilities throughout their marketing organization to give them more up-to-date skills. They still have an LMS and a course catalog. They still do all the traditional L&D things. But the point in all this is that they're acknowledging that they have an incredibly diverse workforce that's spread all around the world. And all of those people want and need different things. And so does the business. And so MasterCard segments those people into logical groups, and they're designing, developing, and delivering differentiated solutions based on what makes sense for those people and for what they're trying to teach them. And by doing that, they're giving learners as well as L&D professionals more choices, and it's working for them. And we think that's what more organizations should be doing, is giving people choices, not sticking rigidly to the one-size-fits-all infrastructure that they've been accustomed to. Something else happens when you approach L&D from the learner's perspective, though. As I said before, it's partly about how people learn, but it's also about what they learn. And so when you start thinking about learners first, what we see is that organizations tend to start thinking very differently about the things that people learn. They focus more effort on the things that the business and individuals care about, like leadership, soft skills, and sales. And coincidentally, those are also the things that enable strategy and drive business performance. So they tend to be correlated better with higher performing L&D organizations. That doesn't mean that you don't do the operational and compliance stuff. For example, on desktop applications or proprietary processes or generic training for industry certifications. Of course, you have to still do those things. They're important. But higher performing L&D organizations, the ones that are better aligned with business priorities, the ones that deliver more effective learning solutions more efficiently, they make it a point to do compliance and operational training smarter. It's not about appeasing people. It's about being better business partners. A good example here is Dave DiFilippo, the CLO at Bank of New York Mellon. He recognized a couple of years ago that his workforce, which is about 50,000 people, were spending a lot of time on redundant compliance training. Now, that's just like every other banker in the universe. Regulatory compliance is a critical part of operating in a banking environment. But he also had to be responsive to the productivity drain that that caused, particularly when some of this material was redundant. So what he and his team did was to put in the time and the effort to work with their regulators to enable their bankers to test out of some compliance requirements if they had already passed those courses before and if they hadn't had any violations or incidents. And that's thousands of hours of productivity that they've given back, not just to the company, but to their people. Some of that time can go back into training on more strategic topics, more business-oriented topics, and some of that time can go back into actual work. So takeaway number 2 for us is that modernizing workplace learning demands some big shifts in how we think about L&D. And those shifts start with putting learners first. But different mindsets and the best intentions are only going to take you so far. For a whole variety of reasons, most L&D organizations are having trouble actually making the shift. And that's because reimagining how L&D operates is the easy part. It's the fun part. Again, just coming back very quickly to MasterCard as the case in point, this starts with them thinking about the role differently. This is the easy part. The hard part is making all that stuff work. This is about reimagining and rebuilding L&D for the learners. So the hard part is actually reinventing workplace learning. Transforming how L&D works all at once is a huge, complicated job. Some organizations are going that route. It often takes months or years, depending on how complicated the organization is. And it can also involve lots of effort and pain. But the point is, and there are faster and cheaper and simpler ways to begin to do this more incrementally as well. But whichever route you take, the point is not that cost-cutting and reorganizing that's involved. The point is investing time and money differently to get different, better results out of L&D. And if you think about it, L&D organizations really only invest in 3 things. They invest in people, content, and tools. So for starters, the organizations that are putting learners first seem to be making this shift by approaching content and programs differently. Some of that's what I described earlier. They're still doing programs and classes and online courses, but they're also beginning to tilt the balance much more heavily towards more experiential, more social, more on-demand learning experiences. They're also shifting towards more modern formats like short videos and simulations and apps and games. And they're focusing on different kinds of topics as well, the things that are the focus for whatever their organization happens to be. And they're able to do that in large part because they're changing their people and their processes. Some of it is changing the way that people think, as I described before. And a big part, is changing the way that those people operate, changing their processes, changing the way that they behave. So the way that they're getting there is some of these people, some of these organizations are cleaning house and they're starting over. I spoke to a big asset management firm last year that got rid of 6 out of the top 7 people in the L&D organization because they wanted to get different kind of results and they just didn't believe that the people were going to make the shift. So those kinds of organizations, and there's a number of those that are taking that approach, are looking for a new kind of learning consultant. They're looking for people that are more business focused than ADDIE and needs analysis focused. They're looking for instructional designers who get the business and the audience better. They're asking them to operate differently. Other organizations are evolving and retraining their existing staff. They're also augmenting them by adding new kinds of people into the mix to work alongside those people. So some organizations, for example, are hiring web designers and UX designers and museum curators to work alongside instructional designers. And several companies, for example, Bank of America, Ernst & Young, LinkedIn, Macy's, and Nike, are creating new roles. They've got product managers, for example, instead of or in addition to their LMS administrators. And these people are doing very different things than they used to. So the problem with different people trying to do different things, though, is that it creates lots of new problems as well. And so those problems demand new and different kinds of technology in order to work better. And that's the third bucket here. Very few authoring tools in LMSs, for example, make it easy to create, to find, to access, or even to track informal learning content or social or on-the-job learning experiences. Those kinds of things require different and dedicated tools. Most authoring tools, like I said, were designed and built for an era where learning was happening one-to-many, the broadcast model. That's not the way things are anymore. Now, people do a lot more than just consume content. They're also crowdsourcing and collaborating on it. So learning is now many-to-many. It's not one-to-many. A lot of learners and L&D teams need better tools for creating and curating and sharing all of that stuff. And we see that in the data. Almost 90% of workers say that sharing knowledge is an important or essential part of learning what they need to do for their jobs. But only around a third of employers have invested in dedicated social learning systems. And just for comparison, almost twice as many big companies use rapid content authoring tools as use social learning systems. These are the things that people use to create all of those crummy page-turner e-learning modules that everybody loves to hate. The second thing that we're seeing organizations who are putting learners first do is to make it faster to find learning. Creating learning is only the first step. Learners also need better tools to find the right things at the right time. We are all overwhelmed by information. We're all impatient, especially online. If we can't find what we want fast, we all move on. But learning content has become so easy to make and so cheap to buy that it's become almost too available. It's not uncommon in some big companies to have 10, 20, 50,000 or more content objects in their LMSs. It's impossible for a lot of companies to find, or for people to find what they need in those systems. I've spoken to dozens of people when I do talks like this who tell me it's taken them 20, 30 minutes to find just the right course. And so it's not a surprise that 80% of workers say that good search tools are critical for learning. And yet, almost 60% of L&D professionals think that one of the biggest obstacles to learning at work is that employees still can't find what they want when they want it. They need better tools for making sense of all of that clutter. Some companies are taking drastic action. Bank of New York Mellon, for example, and BNY have both cut out significant portions of their course catalogs when they move to a cloud-based LMS. And that lack of choice is actually making it easier for people to find just the right thing. And it's driving increased usage. But lack of choice isn't the whole answer. Finding the right content isn't much use if people can't access it. And the obvious example here is mobile. More than half of workers now say that they would like to be able to access learning on mobile devices. Almost everybody, at least in the US, is walking around with a smartphone in their pocket. Now, not all of those people need mobile learning to do their jobs, but the point is more than half of them want it. And yet most companies are still barely scratching the surface when it comes to mobile learning. Yes, more than 70% of organizations, maybe even more now, say that they're doing something with mobile learning. But when you start scratching the surface, it's not quite that clear because only about 12% of learning content is actually mobile ready. And very often, learning is only accessible from behind corporate firewalls. At one big consulting firm that I've spoken to, where something like 70% of the staff works virtually or on the move, there's still very, very little mobile learning. And the little that does exist is only accessible through a clunky app for smartphones that only a tiny fraction of their people use. And the reason for all of that is they're making decisions in the name of security and the ability to track everything. They're not thinking about what makes sense for learners, what makes it easy for people to find and access the right things. And so they've got very little usage of that mobile learning, and they've got people clamoring for mobile accessibility in different ways. And the last thing that companies are doing when they start putting learners first is that they're making it possible to track all the learning that people do. We know, as I said earlier, that individuals are spending a lot more time learning on their own through self-directed methods, through informal methods, than they are through company-provided training. And we also know that almost every CLO out there says that they feel the need and urgency to demonstrate the value of their organization's investments in L&D. But in spite of all that need and urgency, less than 30% of big companies actually capture much data on their informal learning activity. And that's a problem because it's hard to manage L&D when you don't have the big picture. And it's also a problem for individuals because it makes it difficult for them to act on their data when they can't see everything. So even if companies did collect information about all of those things, it's rare for employers to provide workers with access to information about their development beyond basic LMS transcripts. And the reason that that's important is almost 2/3 of working professionals have told us, when we've done surveys, that they would spend more time on informal learning if it was tracked and if they were given professional credit of some kind. So takeaway number 3 for me is that putting learners first requires some very new, different, and better kinds of tools. New and different tools and better tools for creating and curating learning content, better tools for discovering and finding the right learning at the right time, better tools for accessing learning, and better tools for valuing learning. And when I say learning, we mean all kinds of learning, not just formal training. So again, just one more quote to sort of hammer that point home. This one comes from an automotive manufacturer. For them, what this looks like is they would love to have better tools for learning so that they can get information to their employees on the floor quicker. They don't feel like they have them. Don't necessarily think that those tools don't exist. They just don't have them in the company. And so again, it comes back to, number 1, thinking very differently about the kinds of learning experiences we're trying to provide. And number 2, making sure that we back that up with making investments in people, content, and technology to support the things that we're trying to do. And putting learners first requires that L&D organizations operate very differently than they used to. That's all that I've had today. Thanks.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, everybody. This is Mark Eberhardt. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Degreed. And I'll speak briefly about Degreed and what we do, but more important than what we do, I think, is who we are. So at Degreed, we're a group of lifelong learners. Learning is not a 9-to-5 job for us. It's our lives. And enterprise learning specifically, learning that takes place within an organization, is not what it should be. And our goal is to change that. So as you can see from the diagram here, today we live in a world of exploding learning content, articles, videos, online courses, events, this growing learning ecosystem. There's just no good way to capture it. And Degreed is essentially the place where organizations can manage all of this learning. So we integrate with all the learning resources you see here, internal resources, your LMS, content partners, Lynda, Coursera, and we pull all of that learning into Degreed. We also give employees the ability to learn from across the entire web, TED Talks, YouTube, articles, etc. And through all of this, we give organizations a holistic view of what their employees actually know. And a key part of making all this work is that we empower individuals to manage their own learning. We really do believe that learning is not about how organizations control resources or try to create a learning strategy, but rather about having faith and trust that employees know what they need, they know what they want to learn, and how do we empower them to do that. So we're happy to talk further about Degreed, of course, but I'll leave it at that for now. And you can get credit for this webinar. You can go to degreed.com, create a free profile. It takes just a few seconds, and you basically enter the landing page that you use to sign up for this webinar. It'll be added to your profile, and you get credit via Learning Points. So we encourage everybody to do that. And being prolific learners, we attend as many industry events as we can. We attend training events, learning and development events, HR events. So within the next 30 days, here's where we'll be. ATD International, the largest training event in the United States. We'll actually be there next week in Orlando, Florida. And then in June, we'll be at SHRM, the largest HR conference in the United States, and that's in Las Vegas. So with these events, we typically are speaking and exhibiting. So we hope you, if you're attending the conference, we'd love for you to stop by our session or stop by our booth. We'd love to talk to you. Love to meet you in person. And with that, this concludes the presentation. If you have any questions today on what Todd talked about, here are some ways to get in touch with us. You can visit us on our website, obviously. Email Todd directly, give us a call. You can tweet at us @Degreed on Twitter. We love questions. We'd love to talk to you about learning culture in your organization and anything in the enterprise learning space. Any questions you might have, we'd love to engage with you. So do feel free to reach out and ask us questions, and we'll respond as soon as we can. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for joining, and we hope we'll see you on our June webinar in a few weeks. Thanks, everybody.